Hey guys, it's Charlene. I am really excited for today's video. I am going to be talking to you about pretty much everything you've ever wanted to know about inks and maybe some things you didn't know you wanted to know. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to tell you which inks are the best. And that's because different inks are good for different things. We're going to talk about that all throughout this video. Also, which inks are best for something is really subjective. I do suggest that you read about the specific inks that you're interested in before you purchase them. Another disclaimer up front is that some inks will stain your stamps. It shouldn't impact your ability to use the stamp in the future, but if stained stamps is something you want to stay away from, you definitely are going to want to read up on the specific ink that you're purchasing. I'm not going to give you an exhaustive list of inks, but I am going to talk about types of ink, what each type of ink does well, popular brands of ink, considerations to make when you're choosing inks, and lots of other miscellaneous things that I find interesting and that I think you will too. I want to talk first about some general rules. Dye inks are for use with non-water-based products. So I've got some dye inks here, and they work really well with alcohol ink markers such as Copic markers. Another general rule is that pigment inks are for use with water-based products, things like watercoloring or using water-based markers. The third general rule is that hybrid inks are for use with both water-based and non-water-based products. Now that I told you the general rules, I kind of want you to forget them because there are exceptions to all of those rules. So let's jump in. First, let's talk about dye inks. Now, dye inks are made by dissolving a dye into a liquid, generally water. The main exception I have found is Staz-On, which is solvent-based, and we're going to talk about that more later when we talk about some specialty inks. So dye inks are transparent. Now what that means is you can see through the ink. As a result, you're going to see anything underneath the ink that you've stamped. They come in black and they also come in colors. So here you can see I have stamped some black dye ink, and then over that I stamped the word friend in blue dye ink. And you can see all of the details of the butterfly through the ink. This is stamped on 80-pound Nina cover stock in solar white, and most of the examples I show you today that are white are going to be that Nina cardstock. So the way that dye inks work is that they absorb into the fibers of the paper and they dry very quickly. They work well on white as well as light colored cardstock. So here I've stamped in some Nina Desert Storm, and you can see it stamps really well on this light coloring. The reason it's not going to stamp well on dark colored cardstock is because it's transparent. So you can see here, just barely maybe on camera, that very, very faint area where I have stamped it in the blue on the black cardstock. It's just not going to show up at all. You likely have heard the term water reactive. And I just want to tell you now that all water-based dye inks are water reactive. And I want to talk about why that's important. You oftentimes will see on labeling or marketing for a dye ink that it's water reactive. Well, if water is the base of whatever product you're using, it's always going to be reactive to water. So you can see here, this is a dye ink, and I have splashed some water on there, and you can see how it has changed. Now, I want to point this out right now at the beginning because here's distress ink. I oftentimes hear, well, distress ink is water reactive, so is dye ink. What's the difference? There is a difference, and it's in the formulation. I'm going to discuss that a little bit more later, but essentially, distress ink is formulated to wick, which means that it pushes away from itself. As a result, you can see how it gets lighter in the center and then darker on the edges. And you can see in the areas where it gets really dark, that's because that dye has pushed away and it's created this really interesting look. As far as what you can do with dye inks, you can stamp with dye inks. They work very well. You're going to find that some ink pads have a foam pad and some ink pads will have a felt pad. There's a lot of talk about whether foam pads or felt pads are better for stamping. And in my experience, I'm going to tell you, it honestly is not about the pad. It is about the formulation of the ink that you are using. So I have several felt-based pads that stamp really well as several foam pads that stamp really well. So we're going to get more into that in a little bit as I show you some examples. But I want to show you that you also can heat emboss with dye ink. Now you can see there, this I have stamped in Ocean Simon Says Stamp dye ink, positively saturated, and then I heat embossed it with clear embossing powder. And I'm pointing this out because oftentimes people will say, well, dye ink isn't any good for heat embossing. And really what they mean by that is that dye ink has such a quick dry time that you really have to move quickly to get the embossing powder on there in order to make it stick to the ink. That does make it a little bit more difficult to heat emboss with, but it certainly is possible. You also can ink blend with dye ink. I took Cherry and Sunbeam, which are dye inks from Simon Says Stamp. They're the positively saturated line, and I have blended them together using a blending brush, and as a result, they have created a center orange color because the two colors where they overlap are creating a new color, and they ink blend very well. In general, you do have to be a little bit more careful when you're using dye inks not to muddy colors. And what I mean by that is if you were to mix, let's say, green and red dye ink and try and ink blend them together, you're going to get kind of a mucky brown color. And it's, unless that's what you're going for, it's not a great color to have in terms of an ink blend. So just be mindful of the color combinations that you're doing pretty much anytime you're ink blending, but in particular, be careful when you're using dye ink. Something else you can do with dye inks is faux watercolor. And the way you accomplish that is by taking your ink pad and tamping it out onto your surface, such as your glass board or an acrylic block. And then you can either add a little bit of water with a paintbrush or a sprayer, or you can use a water brush that has the water in the tube, and you put your paintbrush in there and then you can paint right onto your cardstock. In general, anytime you're working with water, you do want to use watercolor cardstock. For this specific example, I did not use watercolor cardstock. If you want really intense color, a good way to achieve that is by using re-inkers, which you can put a small drop of your inker onto your surface and use that as your watercolor. And there are also some dye inks, like InkOn3 has a line, that are specifically meant for watercoloring. So they are very rich and vibrant. The other thing you can use dye inks for is alcohol ink markers. So some examples of that are Copic markers. There's also Spectrum Noir markers. Altenew has markers. There's lots of different ones on the market. And you can see how wonderfully they work with dye inks. You just color over and you're not going to have any issues with dye inks. Any of the dye inks I have no issues using alcohol ink markers. Some have a little longer dry time than others. Usually if you're getting any kind of smearing of your ink, it's because you haven't let your ink dry long enough. Something I want to point out, because dye inks work well with alcohol ink markers and other solvent-based products like that, it means that you can also stamp in colors and then color with your alcohol ink markers. So you could stamp this butterfly, for example, in blue and then color it in with purple Copic markers or something along those lines. It's kind of a fun little added bonus with dye inks because oftentimes people have a ton of dye inks in their collection. So next time you're Copic coloring, maybe try stamping in a color and then using your Copic markers. There are many popular lines of dye inks on the market. Lots of companies will have dye inks that match other colors in the items that they sell. So I'm going to pop up a list here of many different companies that are popular, as well as know what type of pad they have on their ink pads, whether it's foam or a felt topped ink pad, just in case that's something that's important to you. Next, let's talk about pigment inks. Now, pigment inks are made from finely ground particles of color that has been suspended in a liquid medium that's generally oil or water. The main exception is Staz-On metallic pigment ink, which I'm going to talk about more when we get to specialty inks. Pigment inks are translucent, and what that means is you can somewhat see through the ink. As a result, you're going to see some of what is underneath the ink when you stamp. So I have stamped this in blue pigment ink, the word friend, on top of a black butterfly that was stamped in dye ink. I'm going to show you the example where I used the blue dye ink to stamp friend, and you can see through a little bit more on the dye ink, but you can still see through quite a bit with the pigment ink. A big thing to note, however, is that pigment inks are going to vary in their opacity. That means some inks you'll be able to see through more than other inks. If you think about opacity in terms of a scale, with transparent being on one end, which is completely see-through, and opaque on the other end, which means that you can't see anything through it at all, there is a huge variety in the middle that is what's called translucent. So something like a white pigment ink is going to be much higher on the opacity scale than something like VersaFine Clair in blue that's also a pigment ink. And you can see here I have stamped that blue pigment ink on the left-hand side, and it's not showing up at all really on this black cardstock. You can kind of see it, but not really. Versus the white pigment ink, you can see really well, and it's a fun way to use your white pigment inks. So this is going to vary based on the type of ink that you're using. It does work well on light colored cardstock, as you can see here. So as you've seen, you can stamp with pigment inks, and they are a very crisp stamp. I will say when you stamp with a pigment ink, they are very easy to see. They have very crisp, solid lines, and they work very well for large, solid images. The other thing you can do with pigment ink is you can heat emboss with pigment ink. So you can see here I stamped in this Warm Breeze pigment ink color, and then I put some clear embossing powder. I do want to show you up against the dye ink that I heat embossed the difference. Here you can see the dye ink that I heat embossed with, and I'm going to kind of turn them in the light so hopefully it picks up on the camera. Pigment ink, because it's a little bit stickier, does tend to grab more of the embossing powder, but it's really not a noticeable difference. So you can, again, heat emboss with the dye ink. You just have to be much quicker, and that's why I do prefer to heat emboss with pigment ink. The other thing you can do with pigment inks is you can ink blend. So I want to go back and talk a little bit about how pigment ink works. Now, pigment ink sits on top of the paper, whereas dye ink soaks into the paper. As a result, you're going to have a longer drying time with pigment ink, and that's also why it works well with embossing powder. You have that extra dry time in order to get your embossing powder on. I was really surprised by how well you can ink blend with pigment inks. Before this video, I had never tried it. I was concerned that you wouldn't be able to get a good blend because of the fact that the pigment sits on top of the paper. Well, I was obviously completely wrong, and it ink blends amazingly. I used red and yellow pigment ink, and I blended them together to create this beautiful orange. So side by side, here is the ink blended dye ink and the ink blended pigment ink. So with pigment inks, you can use water-based mediums. Those are things like watercolors and water-based markers. They work very well. So for this, I stamped in Nocturne pigment ink from VersaFine Clair, and then I used some of my Distress ink in Picked Raspberry, which is a dye ink, and I smushed it out on my work surface, added a little water, and then I just painted over the top. And you can see here the butterfly looks fantastic, and you can see those beautiful sharp lines from the pigment ink right through the watercolor. Now, just like with dye inks, there are several different popular brands of pigment ink on the market. I am going to pop up some of the well-known brands. I personally have VersaFine Clair for my colors, and then I have Hero Hue's Pigment Ink in Unicorn for my white. There are lots of other different ones. Something I do want to point out about the VersaFine Clair versus regular VersaFine pigment ink is Clair is just a little bit of a tweaked formula to allow for some brighter colors. Okay, we've talked about dye inks and pigment inks. Let's talk about hybrid inks. Hybrid inks are made from a combination of dye and pigment ink. They are also translucent, which means you can see somewhat through the ink. It's very similar to pigment ink. The level of opacity is going to vary based on the particular ink color as well as the brand of ink that you're using. They do come in black, white, as well as colors. I don't own a white hybrid ink, but there are some out there. They are slower to dry than dye ink, but faster than pigment ink. Hybrid inks work well on white cardstock. They also work well on light colored cardstock, and they work on dark and black colored cardstock. Just like with pigment ink, how well they work on dark and black cardstock is going to depend on the level of their opacity. So that again depends on the brand as well as the color of the ink. This I've stamped in Hero Hue's Reactive Blue Hawaii, and you can see it on there, but it's not as bright as I wanted it to be. Later, I'm going to show you stamped with Distress Oxide, and it looks fantastic. Hybrid inks work very well for stamping. They also work well for heat embossing. So here I have stamped in the Pool Party, and I have added some Clair embossing powder. They work about as well as the dye inks do. They have a little bit longer dry time. I find that they don't have quite as much of a stickiness to them, so they don't hold quite as much embossing powder as a pigment ink does. You also can ink blend with hybrid inks. So you can ink blend with dye, pigment, or hybrid inks. Something to note with hybrid inks and why they can get a little bit confusing is that some hybrid inks are water reactive and some are not water reactive. If you are looking at a hybrid ink, you do want to pay attention to whether or not it is water reactive. The two most well-known brands that I have found are Distress Oxides, which are water reactive, as well as Hero Hue's Reactive. Now these are all Hero Hue's Reactive. These just have a little bit different labeling because they came in card kits that I received from Hero Arts. Hybrid inks that are not water reactive are fantastic for lots of different applications. Here I have the Picket Fence Studios Black Hybrid Ink Pad. I use this a lot, and that's because it works well for alcohol ink coloring. Here I used some Y06 Copic marker, and it works well for watercolor. I tamped out a little bit of Distress ink in Candied Apple, put some water with it, and I went right over there. What's really interesting is that when you color over your alcohol ink markers with watercolor, you can still do some very interesting blending. So hybrid ink is a fun ink to use if you're wanting to do mixed media. It's really going to make mixed media a lot easier to do because you aren't going to have to worry about it not working with solvent or alcohol-based items or with water-based items. Keep in mind, some of those hybrid inks out there are water reactive. In general, hybrid inks tend to work well in journals because the ink doesn't bleed through like a dye ink may on those thin pages in a journal, and they also have a faster dry time than pigment ink. I'm going to pop on screen several of the popular brands of hybrid inks that are out there. A few things I'll point out is that the Hero Hue's Reactive and Distress Oxides are water reactive, whereas the LDRS Creative Hybrid Ink and some of the others that are up there, the Simon Says Stamp, the Scrapbook.com, and the Tonic Nuvo, those are not water reactive. Okay, we've talked specifically about dye inks, pigment inks, and hybrid inks. As I mentioned, Distress ink are a dye ink and Distress Oxides are a hybrid ink. I want to talk more specifically though about Distress ink and Distress Oxide because they have some really interesting properties that other inks don't tend to have. Distress inks come both in full-sized ink pads like these Distress Oxides as well as minis. I do have all the minis, which is why you'll see them throughout this video. They have about 1/5 of the ink of a standard size ink pad. Distress Oxides don't come in the mini size, and that's because the formulation of the ink won't work well in this smaller size. While Distress Oxides are technically considered a hybrid, their formulation is different from other hybrids on the market. Now, these are made with distressed dye, pigment, plus other proprietary items to make them oxidize when water is introduced. Both distress inks and distress oxides can be stored flat, they can be stored on their side, or they can be stored upside down. Now, if you live in a humid area, you might have some problems with wicking, which is going to impact your storage options. Both have a felt top pad, and that means you may have to press down harder with the ink pad to release the ink when you are trying to stamp. You can stamp with both, which I'm going to show you. Distress inks are transparent, again, because they are a water-based dye ink. Distress oxides, however, are considered translucent. And I would say of all the inks that I personally have, these probably have the most opacity. So you can't see too much of those butterfly details from behind. They both stamp well on white and light colored cardstock. Distress ink, however, does not stamp well on black or dark colored cardstock, whereas Distress oxide, you can see, looks amazing on black or dark colored cardstock. As I mentioned, you can stamp with both. I will tell you that the Distress oxide tends to stamp much cleaner than the Distress ink, and that has to do with the formulation. I'm going to be talking about a lot of fun water techniques that you can do with Distress inks, and as a result, they tend to beat up on your stamp, and you have to stamp several times in order to get a decent impression. You don't have to do that so much with the Distress oxide, and in fact, they stamp really beautifully. You also can heat emboss with both Distress oxide and Distress ink. They both look wonderful, and they do tend to retain a fair amount of clear embossing powder when you are covering it. And you also can ink blend with both Distress ink and Distress oxide. They both blend very well. I will say, if you are newer to ink blending, Distress oxide I have found to be the easiest type of ink to ink blend with. It is very, very creamy. It is very forgiving. As a result, it's much harder to get dark spots or strange lines or things like that that might happen with your straight dye inks. Distress inks, because they are a water-based dye ink, work very well with alcohol ink markers. You can stamp in any color of dye ink and it's going to work well with alcohol ink markers. I've stamped this in Distress ink in black soot and it works great with Copic markers. Let's talk more about the water reactive nature. As I mentioned earlier, all water-based dye inks are water reactive, but you can really see the difference in how the Distress inks work compared to your standard water-based dye ink. And that's because of that formulation of the Distress ink. Distress oxides have a similar formulation. It is a wicking ink. So that means that the color pushes away and the color is going to become more intense as you add water. In addition, Distress oxides oxidize. So there's some type of additive in the formulation of Distress oxides that make it so when you add water in, it gets this white, fun color. And you can do lots of neat techniques with that. They are both water reactive indefinitely. So that means, 5, 6, 7, 10 days after you have created your art, if you want to go back and add some more water, they are still going to react to the water. There is a product called Distress Microglaze, and this will seal Distress ink and Distress oxide and stop it from being water reactive. This also works well with alcohol inks on Yupo paper to seal alcohol inks, and it makes it so that you can't wipe away the alcohol ink, and it removes kind of that stickiness of the alcohol ink. If you heat an area that you have put microglaze on, only your intended area is going to stay sealed. So what I mean by that is if you were to stamp out that butterfly with, let's say, picked raspberry, and you had your butterfly and you applied your Distress glaze and then you heated it with your crafting tool, only the stamped portion of the butterfly is going to remain sealed. So that means that you could watercolor over the top of that and it's going to stay sealed. It's not going to be water reactive, and you can then use both your distress inks or your distress oxide for watercolor techniques. I will point out that you don't want to oversaturate, because the way that dye ink works is that it penetrates into the surface of the paper, down into the fibers of the paper. So if you put too much water when you're watercoloring, the water can get underneath the sealed portion and it can get under there and pull the ink out that's down inside the fibers of the paper. That's a whole different technique. It's lots of fun. Let me know down in the comments if that's something that you guys would be interested in seeing more about. So just like with dye inks that I showed you earlier, you can also tamp out on your mat the distress ink or the distress oxide, add some water, and use it as a watercolor with either a watercolor brush or a water brush, and they both work beautifully. They look a little bit different from each other, so it's something you should definitely experiment with to see what you want to use. You also can use them for ink smooshing, which is a very fun water-based technique. Here I used picked raspberry oxide and I used squeezed lemonade distress ink, and you can see the ink tends to be a little bit more vibrant, whereas the oxide gets this hazy pastel look. So they look really fantastic when you use them both together when you're ink smooshing. You do want to make sure you dry between layers, and if you want to have a more blended look, you can start with your paper misted with water. The way you do this ink smooshing technique is essentially you smoosh out some of the ink onto your work surface, and then you spray it with some water, and then you take your cardstock, some type of watercolor cardstock, and you're going to tamp it down into that ink. And those inks are going to smoosh onto your paper and combine in all of these fun different ways. If you're working on a glass mat, the inks tend to kind of muddy together a little bit, whereas if you're working on a craft or a silicone mat, the colors tend to bead and separate. So I think a silicone or craft mat is the better option when you are doing this ink smooshing technique. The other type of water-based technique you can do is called the drip technique, which is really fun. So you can either ink blend or you can apply your ink pads direct to paper, which is what I did here. I applied it along the top, and then you can add water and it's going to cause those colors to drip down. And you can see how well the distress oxide, because it is a hybrid ink and has a combination of dye and pigment, how well the pink shows up on top of the yellow. You almost can't see that there is yellow underneath there. So distress oxide and distress ink have lots of different fun applications. This is just the tip of the iceberg. If you'd like to see me do a video more in depth and show these techniques in action, let me know down in the comments. Lastly, let's talk about specialty inks. There are a lot of different specialty inks on the market. So generally when I look at what I consider a specialty ink is I'm looking at, is this ink meant for a very specific type of application? So the first one I want to talk about is Stazon Jet Black Solvent Ink. And this works very well for non-porous surfaces. So it works well for glass, metal, shrink plastic, vellum, glossy paper, foil, acrylic, acetate, all kinds of different things like that. If you're ever wanting to stamp on some type of non-porous surface, you can see here that the Staz-On works really, really well. This has been just stamped on some vellum and it looks awesome. Now Staz-On is solvent ink, so it is very difficult to clean off of stamps. You do need a specialty cleaner, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Next, let's talk about metallic inks. There's lots of different metallic inks out there, and some are water-based, some are solvent-based. It is a little bit difficult, I will tell you, to find out what type of base some of these inks have, because the manufacturers and the companies that are selling them don't list the information on their websites. In any event, I have found that most metallic inks work the same way because they are pigment inks. Here I have stamped out this metallic gold onto a piece of white cardstock, and it's probably a little hard to pick up on camera, but in real life it is very pretty. It has a very faint gold shimmer to it. I will say with metallic inks, you do need to stamp several times to get this kind of nice coverage that I have here with the butterfly. I think I stamped 4 to 5 times with the metallic ink to get this specific result. Now, metallic inks do work really well on dark or black colored cardstock. You can see this is a really neat effect here with the metallic ink on there. And I will show you this. They work fantastic with stencils. It's just really quite beautiful how they show up and shimmer in different ways as you turn something in the light. I definitely recommend, if you have metallic inks, trying them out with a stencil on dark colored or black cardstock. They just look really beautiful. And with metallic inks, because it's not clear on a lot of them what they are based with, if they're solvent or water based or something like that, some of them do work well on non-porous surfaces like the vellum or the acetate. Be sure to read the description of whatever ink you have to see what it's going to work well on. I'm going to pop up here several brands of popular metallic pigment ink. There's a few of them on the market. I'm sure there's more than what I have listed here, but these are the main ones that I could find. Next up is Embossing Ink. Embossing ink is a sticky, no color ink. You can find it sometimes in color where it has a faint colored hue to it. You also can find it where it has a shimmer added to it, which is very pretty. But in general, when someone is talking about embossing ink, they are talking about the no color sticky ink. Lots of different brands on the market. My preferred one is VersaMagic, and this works well for lots of different things. It works well for heat embossing. So here you can see I stamped this in the embossing ink, and then I added black embossing powder. I do briefly want to show you a difference here between using clear embossing powder versus a colored embossing powder with that sticky embossing ink. Going back again to the pigment ink where I added clear embossing powder on the top, you can see it has a fair amount of shine and it looks nice. But when you heat emboss with colored embossing powders, you're just gonna get a different look. It tends to look more solid. It seems like there's more to it. I definitely recommend trying both when you are heat embossing because you're going to get different results with both. Embossing ink also works really well with metallic embossing powders. This is probably one of my favorite looks when it comes to cards. This is Antique Gold from Simon Says Stamp, and it is one of my favorites. It's just a really beautiful tone of gold. And because that embossing powder is metallic, you're getting the shine from the embossing powder that's melted, but you're also getting the added shine of the metallic. So it's definitely a very nice kind of bling addition to your cards. Now, embossing ink can also be used to watermark. So all I did was stamp this in the VersaMagic embossing ink on some craft cardstock, and you can see it creates this really interesting effect. It just essentially darkens the cardstock where it's been stamped. So if you're looking for a really fun, subtle background, you can just stamp with embossing ink and have a nice watermark. One of the popular techniques with embossing ink is the clear powder resist technique. So essentially you stamp out in your embossing powder and then you heat emboss with clear embossing powder, and then you can ink blend over the surface. And it's kind of like this magic reveal. It's a really fun technique and it gives you a really beautiful look. Another technique you can do with embossing ink is pearl powders. Now this is actually what got me into card making in the first place. I absolutely fell in love with pearl powders. I thought they were just the most amazing, shimmery, beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And it started me on my rabbit hole of crafting. I know a lot of people, their gateway is heat embossing, but mine was pearl powders. The way this works is you stamp with your embossing ink, and then you use some type of pearl powder. These are perfect pearls. And you use a stiff bristled brush, and you put a little bit of the powder on, and you rub it all around so that that sticky ink, the pearl powder attaches to it and stays set. And then you want to use some type of sweep brush. You could use this same bristled brush, but I recommend using a soft sweep brush to sweep away the excess powder. And then you just mist it very lightly with some water to set it. Once it's done, it's on there permanently. It's not going to come off. And I think it's just a fun and pretty technique. When you do it on white cardstock, it creates this kind of like magic. You don't really see it. And then when you turn it in the light, it just lights up. When you do it on dark cardstock, it has this kind of holographic look to it. It is just very, very pretty. If you like working with alcohol inks, something fun to try is alcohol lift ink. Alcohol lift ink is designed to lift alcohol ink from a non-porous surface and transfer it to a porous surface. You'll have your alcohol inks on your Yupo paper, which is a non-porous surface, and then you'll put some alcohol lift ink onto your stamp it onto the surface. It is going to cause that color to get pulled up onto the stamp, and then you can stamp that color off onto a porous surface like cardstock. Once you have lifted from your non-porous surface, you want to dab off the excess that might be left of the alcohol ink and then kind of buff it dry so that you truly get that beautiful impression of whatever you stamped. I just think this is really fun. It's magical. People look at it and go, how in the world did you do that? For the last of the specialty inks, I want to talk about no line coloring ink. So these are inks that are designed for coloring so that hopefully when you're done, depending on how much practice you have, hopefully when you are done, it will look like your image is hand drawn and hand colored. I have just started playing with no line coloring, so I'm going to show you my examples here. There are certainly some really amazing talented artists out there that do no line coloring, and they're going to be able to show you its true potential. But me as a beginner, I wanted to show you kind of how it looks. So here I used the InkOn3 Fade Out No Line Coloring Detail ink. And then for this one, I used the Hero Arts Contour ink. These are both a little bit different in that InkOn3, its ink is formulated to essentially take on the color of whatever you are coloring over it with, versus Contour ink here from Hero Arts is a hybrid ink in a very, very light shade of gray. And there's a couple of other different popular brands on the market, and I will pop those up here for you to take a look. You can see here, essentially with the InkOn3 No Line, you really don't see those lines underneath there. If you do, it's very, very faint in that it has sort of taken on the color of the Copic marker that I have colored with, versus with the Hero Arts Contour ink, you can see the lines just faintly, and they really are just that same color all the way throughout. They don't vary quite as much. I think both of these work very well, and they're kind of fun, and I'm going to be practicing more and playing with these in the future. Lastly, I wanted to talk about Archival inks. They're not really a specialty ink because they are water-based dye inks, but they are an ink that has been formulated to resist weathering and fading. So I don't have any examples here because you're going to find that a lot of your standard dye inks are also considered archival inks. For example, Catherine Pooler, Ranger has a line of archival inks, and so it's best to check the ink description if using an archival ink is something that's important to you. There are many other specialty types of inks out there. These are just a few that I've touched on. If you'd like me to do any videos on these more in depth to show you the techniques, definitely let me know down in the comments. Okay, so at this point, you're probably completely overwhelmed with all of the different kinds of inks and all the different kinds of things they can do. And you're probably thinking, I have no idea what I want to buy. I'm also going to give you kind of a list of considerations to make when you are choosing your inks. The first consideration you want to make is what surface are you going to be working on? Are you going to be using light colored or dark cardstock? Are you going to be using a porous surface such as cardstock or watercolor paper? Or are you going to be using a non-porous surface like acetate or vellum or glass? What's the thickness of your paper? Is it very thin or is it very thick? So think about what type of surface you're using and what you use most often. The second consideration you want to make is what technique are you going to be using? Are you stamping? Are you heat embossing? Are you going to be doing ink blending or watercolors? Are you using alcohol ink markers? Are you going to be stenciling maybe? Are you going to do an emboss resist technique? Are you working with alcohol inks? There's lots of different techniques that you can use, and different inks are going to work better for different techniques. The third consideration is what type of stamp are you using? Are you using a sentiment stamp, a background stamp? Is it an image outline that you're going to be coloring? Or is it a solid image that you're going to be stamping and you want to make sure you get really good coverage? The fourth consideration is what colors do you like? Now, I'm not of the opinion that you should only purchase your favorite colors. For example, I'm not a huge fan of the color green, but I do need several shades of green for when I'm working on projects because you think about trees and leaves and all kinds of different stuff that are the color green. And lastly, the fifth consideration is, do you mainly use products from a specific company? And the reason I say that is because oftentimes a company's line of inks will coordinate with other items such as cardstock. So it makes it a little bit easier to decide what color of ink to use if you are using a matching colored cardstock. It also makes following tutorials from that company a little bit easier because you're not having to pick an ink that's similar in color. You can just reach for the exact color that they are discussing in that tutorial. So those are my 5 considerations. I think they are a good way to determine what type of inks you should choose depending on your specific project. So this has been a ton of information, and I want to go back and talk about some of the myths that I have debunked. So the first is that distress ink and distress oxide are not for stamping. As you've seen, that is false. Whether you choose to stamp with distress ink or distress oxide is largely going to depend on the aesthetic that you're going for. The second myth we debunked is that foam pads are better for stamping than felt pads. This is false. Distress oxide as well as pigment inks both have a felt topped pad and they stamp really well. So really what you're looking at is what is the formulation of the ink. That's going to determine how your inks stamp. The third myth we've debunked is that pigment inks will not ink blend. Next, we debunked that all dye and all pigment inks are the same. Making inks is a complicated chemical process. The desired characteristics of an ink are going to determine the chemicals and the process that is used by the manufacturer. This is what makes some inks better for certain techniques than others. And often you will have a company or a brand that says, I want to create an ink line that works really well for this, whatever this is. And they're going to decide, okay, is dye ink, pigment ink, hybrid ink, which one works the best? What base should I use? Should that be water, oil, solvent? What do I want to use in order to get the best outcome for these particular characteristics I want the ink to have? And don't forget, There is a literal rainbow of colors out there. Every ink is a different color. So there is a lot of variety in all of the dye and pigment inks that are out there on the market. The last myth that we debunked is that only certain inks are going to work for heat embossing. As you've seen, all of the inks work for heat embossing. Now, some are easier to heat emboss with, and that's mostly because of their dry time. Pigment inks, hybrid inks, longer dry time. It's a little bit easier. You don't have to rush as quickly as you would with a dye ink. And it also depends on the formulation of that dye ink. Some dye inks are stickier, so you're going to get more embossing powder to stay on the paper than you would with other inks. I'm sure there are other myths that we debunked as we were going through, but those were the main ones that I wanted to bring back to your attention. So something I get asked about a lot is which black ink should I use for watercolor and which black ink should I use for alcohol ink coloring. I want to touch on that specifically and show you everything all together because I think it's a little bit easier to visualize the differences. In general, a black dye ink is going to work very well with alcohol ink markers. A black pigment ink is going to work well for watercolor, and a black hybrid ink is going to work well for both. Which one is the best is really subjective. I use all of these different inks, and I have found what really makes the difference is how long I give them to dry. If you're working with a dye ink, it's going to need less time to dry than if you're working with a hybrid ink or a pigment ink. It's also going to depend on if you want to be able to use the same ink pad for both types of coloring. A hybrid ink is going to allow you to do both. That's in general. Some hybrid inks, as we talked about earlier, are water reactive. So you can see here, I frequently use Picket Fence Studios Black Hybrid Ink, and that's because I can do both alcohol ink marker coloring as well as watercoloring. This ink though, because it's a hybrid, you do need to give it a little bit of time to dry. A popular dye ink is the Momento Tuxedo Black as well as Black Soot Distress Ink. I don't see this one talked about as much, but these both work beautifully for alcohol ink marker coloring. No smudging and no issues. For black pigment ink, any kind of black pigment ink, if you let it dry completely, and again, pigment ink takes a longer time to dry, is going to work well for watercoloring. So here I have used the VersaFine Clair in Nocturne, and you can see no smudging, no issues, and it looks beautiful. Hopefully that kind of clears up which ink is for which type of technique, and you'll be able to better choose on your next project. Let's talk about cleaning your stamps. Now this is something every crafter wants, is the perfect cleaner to get ink off your stamps. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I'm going to tell you off the bat that there is no perfect cleaner that I have found. Some inks tend to stain stamps, some don't. Some come off easier with certain products than other products. And that all goes back to that formulation concept. What is the ink made out of? That's really going to impact how you clean your stamps. Now there are a couple of all-purpose cleaners on the market. There is Staz-On All-Purpose Stamp Cleaner. There's Archival Ink Cleaner, as well as the Ink Off Stamp Cleaner from InkOn3. This InkOn3 Stamp Cleaner is really interesting because it comes in a pad form, which is really convenient. You can rub it on your stamp and clean them off easily. I am guessing I'm going to use this one a lot more. I just recently purchased it so I could show you for this video. I'm going to talk about something that is hotly contested, and that is isopropyl alcohol. Now, this is a mild solvent, and it is safe to use in small amounts for cleaning photopolymer stamps. It is not safe to use for cleaning rubber stamps because over time the rubber may degrade. Again, that is a hotly contested issue. I'm just telling you because my research has shown me that it's actually okay in small amounts to use for cleaning the photopolymer stamps, and also in my own experience. I frequently use it to clean my photopolymer stamps. For water-based dye inks, you can use just water. You can spray some water on your stamp and then wipe it off. You You also can use baby wipes. Baby wipes, if you're going to purchase them, it's best generally to purchase alcohol-free ones because then you could use them for both your photopolymer as well as your rubber stamps. They are, however, not great for the environment, so that's something to keep in mind. There are lots of different cleaning accessories that you can use to make it a little bit easier to clean your stamps. There are chamois style towels on the market. This is the Gina K Designs Tidy Towel, and this is the Lawn Fawn Stamp Chamois. Some people love these, some people don't. I frequently will use my chamois in order to clean my stamps. Also, there is the Picket Fence Studios Stamp Scrubber. Something I really like to use this for in particular is when I get a brand new stamp, is to clean the stamp with this, because if there's any leftover bits of photopolymer or things like stuck in between the crevices of the stamp as a result of the manufacturing process, this is going to get those off of there. Also, I have found recently that this works really well for spot cleaning of your blending brushes. So you can spray this with a little bit of water and wipe your brush on here, and because of the material that this scrubby is made out of, it's going to pull that ink and water off of your blending brush. So great for an in-between cleaning of your blending brushes. Lastly is low lint towels. These are also called flour sack towels. These are wonderful for cleaning off stamps, but they're even better for cleaning off stencils. So I use these all the time. I also sometimes use a wet, just washcloth. This is a low lint washcloth, so I don't get any lint coming off onto my stamp when I use this. So there's lots of different options out there. None of them are ideal or perfect. I would say that the things I probably reach for most often are my low lint towels when I'm working with stencils. I will reach for my scrubby or one of my chamois and some water when I'm working with dye inks. If I'm working with inks that are a little harder to get off of my stamp, I will often reach for the isopropyl alcohol. And if I'm working with some really heavy duty inks like Staz-On or red inks or things like that, I will reach for these. Now these do have a little bit of an oily feel to them as well as a smell. Isopropyl alcohol obviously has an alcohol smell to it, so if you are sensitive to smells, these are probably not your best options. I hope that's helpful. I wish I could tell you one cleaner that's going to work amazing for everything. I personally haven't found it. Maybe somebody knows one and they can put it down in the comments. All right, guys, that leads me to a very exciting announcement. I am going to be starting a channel membership. And the reason I'm doing that at this point, I've been thinking about it for a while. The reason I'm doing it at this point is because I've put together an ebook with all of the information that I've talked about in this video. It's an ebook all about inks. So if you want to have a paper resource that outlines all of the information that I talked about today, definitely look into channel membership because that's going to be a perk for that. So I will put down in the description more information about channel membership if that is something that you're interested in. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you picked up some good tips and tricks today that you can implement in your own craftiness at home. If there's anything that you want to see more of, let me know down in the comments. If there's something that you found particularly helpful, let me know as well. Until next time, happy crafting.